Crown-backed New Zealand Growth Capital Partners is seeking more than $400 million from the government in the next budget to set up a seed fund of funds and a second vintage of the Elevate Fund, which operates in the venture capital space. Joining me now is NZGCP CEO Rob Everett and Chief Investment Officer James Pinner. Well, welcome, gentlemen. You've talked about exploring the idea of a new seed fund of funds program, similar to the way I understand Elevate operates, which, all on a later stage. Why do you see a need for that?
I'll start, and I'm sure James will finish for me. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this area as a kind of full ecosystem, right up from a very, very early stage company all the way through to big rounds being done by VC funds and, potentially ending up sort of going offshore and becoming a really sizable company. So all those parts need to fit together. And what Elevate did was provide a real impetus at the VC fund level. So both in terms of encouraging and creating VC funds, but also putting firepower up there. So now we're thinking about, well, what's going to feed into Elevate, and our thinking around the possibility of a new seed fund of funds is as much about making sure there's a pipeline of stuff coming up from the smaller piece of the ecosystem up to Elevate, and also, which I'm sure James will talk about, encouraging the growth of a fund manager sector at that level of the ecosystem rather than the VC fund.
Which is more risky, though.
Yeah,
it is, yeah. But you need those institutional seed investors to be able to build a pipeline of those, to take those high risks really early on, to then build a pipeline of Series A, B companies for the VCs. So it's two pieces. One is the sort of getting more institutional seed investment going on to build a pipeline of the later stage companies, and the emerging managers. So Elevator's got a partial market development objective in terms of seeding some of the most promising venture capital managers, but also a longer term commercial objective. So the way we see institutional money coming into the more Kiwi savers coming in is we have to prove up the asset class is valid. So we can only take a certain amount of risk in terms of those emerging managers, which is why we think a separate fund with a more market development focus would be really
Isn't that similar to what VIF was originally, though?
I think the biggest problem with VIF when it started was that the market wasn't mature enough. There wasn't enough good portfolio companies to be investing in, and had a pretty limited opportunity set. So and the market, there just wasn't the maturity across all sectors, and that's what we're trying to do. We've taken a bit of a step back to work on, making sure we're building a pipeline of companies coming through for the later stage investors, and making sure there's investors at each stage as well, and diversity of those investors as well, which is an area we want to work on.
Yeah, so I would just add on the seed fund of fund. When you think about our mandate to develop the ecosystem, there's lots of stuff we're already doing that we think can contribute to that, and a lot more that we think we can do. We just think that Elevate has actually been quite successful in putting a framework around that sort of development, and if we replicated something a bit like that sort of further down the ecosystem, if I can use that expression, that it would speed it up. So yeah, that's the thinking there.
How far advanced is you planning on this?
Well, we've had a number of conversations with MB and Treasury and Government, all of which have gone well in terms of why you would have something like that and what can be learnt from Elevate. But, we're running into a budget process, so we don't know yet how that will transpire. So I think our thinking about why you would have one and roughly how we would construct it, we're pretty advanced with that, and we've spoken to a bunch of people in the industry, but we don't know yet when funding might come for that, and we would need more funding to get that off the ground.
So how soon might we see it if it did get approved,
Well, subject to James and his team and the capacity. I mean, I think if we got approval, we could probably get something going reasonably quickly, certainly either a pilot program or the program itself. So, if you look at the normal budget cycle, possibly as early as July. But, it just depends on where we are in the process really at this point.
You've also talked about coming to the end of the existing vintage for Elevate and looking at a second vintage. What might that involve? Is that another tranche of money? Or?
Yeah, it is ultimately. So when we're looking at the venture capital funds, and we've been seeding a lot of first-time managers in particular, with the time it takes for those companies to actually mature and for the funds to be able to get exits, you've really got to be, that's sort of 7 to 10 years, and the funds are raising money every 3 to 4 years. So we've really got to be backing the first and second vintages of those funds for them to then be self-sufficient.
Which you've done with Blackbird, haven't you?
Yes, we have, yeah.
And we're biased, obviously. But I think what James has just described is how we see it for the ecosystem as a whole, which is the machinery has largely been built, and we're hearing this from overseas investors too, that the machinery has largely been built. The aspirations are there. It's just a question of keeping the momentum going and preferably accelerating the momentum. And of course, the challenge with that is it needs money.
How much are you looking for?
Well, sky's the limit. I mean, another Elevate, so another 300 would be a starting point. Over time, and of course, these fund of funds program invest over quite a long period of time. You know, you could put anything from $300 to $1 billion into this space and still get it spent productively, but you wouldn't want to be doing that in a few years. That's a 5, 10, 15 year time frame.
But certainly for the second vintage, you're looking at a similar amount.
Yes.
Yeah. And again, is that subject to budget sort of considerations for next year?
Yeah.
Right. A lot of people talk about Elevate as being a 300 million fund, but in fact it's actually just 260 million, isn't it, available to invest? So what's the difference? Where's the other 40?
Again, that's subject to a budget bid, really, essentially. So, yeah, it was envisaged as a $300 million fund. We, between us and NZ Super, contributed $260 million, and we're just working through that budget bid as well.
So I think at the outset, the additional 40 sort of bets were hedged as exactly where that was going to come from.
Okay.
And so at this point, the conversation is beginning to land as, well, where is that coming from?